Hi everyone, welcome to episode 9 of the After Hours podcast. And I'm really excited about this episode because we're going to be speaking about a topic that I'm really interested in. And we're also going to have a guest who's really knowledgeable in this topic. So, the topic we're going to speak about today is about environmental economics. And I actually studied a few modules on environmental economics, and I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on this topic. And I think that environmental economics is a stream of economics that's becoming increasingly popular and increasingly important simply because of the fact that now everyone is realizing how important the environment is. And you've got very, very prominent economists such as Esther Duflo, who won a Nobel Prize in economics very recently, who are saying, that environmental economics is now becoming increasingly popular. Economists are moving away from development economics towards environmental economics. And yeah, this is what's really sparking the interest in environmental economics and the applications it has to the real world. So, as I mentioned, I did my undergraduate dissertation on environmental economics. I did it on the topic of illegal fishing. And today I'm really excited to bring on our podcast a close friend of mine. His name is Akshay, and he is currently studying environmental economics as a master's in the UK. So let's give it to Akshay. Let's ask him to introduce the topic, and first let's ask him to introduce himself.
Hello everybody, my name is Akshay and I am a master's student here at the University of York. I'm doing my master's in environmental economics, and today I'm going to be the guest on today's podcast. Before I begin, I want to thank Tanish and Rishabh for having me on. Thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of this podcast. I watch every episode and I'm sort of always at the edge of my seat waiting for the next one to come out. So I absolutely love it. Thank you. So today I want to talk about something which some of you may know, some of you may not know. I know, Tanish, you know about this subject. But I want to talk to everybody about environmental economics, and I also want to talk about how I've used this subject to rethink my relationship with nature and how I think all of us can sort of do that.
Thank you, Akshay, for introducing yourself to our viewers. Could you tell us more about environmental economics and why you got into it and why it's becoming such an important field?
Right. So I stumbled into environmental economics somewhere around the middle of my undergraduate degree. I majored in economics and I did a minor in environmental studies at Ashoka University. I graduated last year, and I was always sort of enticed by the idea of combining two disciplines that seem like they could never gel together, that are so polarizing, that sit on two ends of the spectrum, and I thought there has to be a synergy between the two. And so I sort of did some reading. I was looking at what's out there, some pretty basic Google searches, and I stumbled into the world of environmental economics. It got to the point where I was like, this is it. This subject and this synergy of two amazing disciplines, such vital disciplines, it's a confluence of everything I care about and everything I want to work on in the world, sort of things I'm interested in. And so I sort of took a leap of faith, and here I am in this crazy, amazing world. And so I want to just briefly paint a picture of what environmental economics is for all of you who don't know, and then we can move on to the next few bits of how we can use a subject like this to reshape such a fundamental relationship in our lives. So, environmental economics sort of began in the latter half of the last century. So we're looking anywhere between 1960s onwards, and it sort of began when conservation scientists started framing environmental issues in economic terms. They did this to gain political support from politicians policy advisors, so on and so forth. And from that sort of root, we got environmental economics. And these days, when we think about environmental economics and we think about everything it encompasses, we've got an array of things. We have a menu of things, and I sort of want to briefly talk about the menu of things. So, first and foremost, this arm of economics is concerned with environmental issues. So, we are concerned with the allocation of natural resources and how we can achieve an efficient allocation of these natural resources. This should sound familiar for all of you who know the basics of economics, the age-old question, right? Scarcity. We have unlimited wants and limited resources. Here we're kind of doing the same thing, but we're looking at natural resources. So we look at natural capital, and by this I'm talking about forests, I'm looking at oceans, I'm looking at mangroves, I'm looking at everything that falls under the definition of nature, right? Secondly, it looks at the financial impacts of environmental issues. We look at how natural disasters have an effect on our economy. We look at how it has an effect on our society, and we try to work through that to come up with efficient and pragmatic solutions. Another strand of environmental economics is to look at the market for environmental goods. Again, here we're talking about anything. We can look at a log of wood, or we could look at the market for mangroves, because mangroves are great for coastal protection. So it encompasses these things in addition to sort of other environmental concepts and frameworks, in particular biodiversity conservation and protection, and the ecosystem services framework. Lastly, and I've sort of touched upon this, environmental economics also looks at the economic impacts of environmental policies. So if we tomorrow were to say no plastic bags, right? This is an age-old thing that most countries are trying to push for. What are the economic impacts of that? What are the offsets created by that? So this is sort of everything that environmental economics encompasses. And so as you go deeper into this subject, the synergy between economics and environmental sciences or environmental management, you actually find that instead of being so polarizing, they actually have a lot in common. You find that the synergy between the two is everywhere when you look at it, right? In the sort of goods we consume. I'll ask you all to stop for a second. Just look around you. The air we're breathing, the things you're looking at, the things you're touching, the things you're sitting on or lying down on, depending on how you're watching this podcast. Everything we eat, everything we taste, everything we drink, it's all made out of natural resources. And so when we start commodifying and creating goods and services from these natural resources, how do we look at nature then? Do we look at it as just the raw materials? Or do we stop and think there's a lot of natural capital, or for lack of a better word, environmental goods gone into making this product? So that's sort of a very brief and cursory way of looking at what environmental economics encompasses and what it does.
Thank you for your analysis, Akshay. Given that you studied a lot about environmental economics, how has it changed your perspective about the human-nature relationship?
So I want to briefly walk us through how I've begun to rethink my relationship with nature. I think rethinking and reshaping our own relationship with nature, and more widely the human nature relationship, is so important, especially in this century. To begin doing that, we need to first look at two very important outlooks which have shaped such a relationship. On the one hand, we have the anthropocentric outlook, and on the other hand, we have the ecocentric outlook. Now, The anthropocentric outlook states that human beings are the most important entity in the universe, that everything has a value because it's useful to us human beings, and everything operates in relation to the human. The ecocentric outlook states that everything has an intrinsic value, that it has a value outside of the value human beings have placed on it. A brief illustration of this is tomorrow you go outside and you look at a tree. The anthropocentric outlook would say that the human nature relationship there is that the tree gives us shade. If it bears fruits, then it gives us fruits. If it bears flowers, then it gives us flowers. It has a certain use value attached to it. It could also have a cultural value. So we think of a lot of indigenous communities that dwell in forests and how they rely heavily on their surroundings for their way of living. There's also an aesthetic value. So if you walk through any forest and you think it's pleasant or it's beautiful or there's a sense of serenity around it, that's an aesthetic value you place on it. The ecocentric outlook would state that this tree exists on its own and it has a value on its own outside of all the values I've just spoken about in the anthropocentric view. Now, one of the ways we can start to reshape our relationship with nature is to bring these two outlooks together. And so, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you begin to look at how certain indigenous communities have lived their lives, they don't view themselves separate from nature. They don't believe that the human being exists outside of the environment and the environment only feeds and supports them. Instead, they believe they are one and a part of the environment. They don't place themselves above it, they don't place themselves outside of it, but rather within it, around it, shaped by it, and shapes it. We see this a lot with indigenous communities that live off the land, in the food that they eat, the clothes that they wear, how they protect their territory so ferociously because they need it to exist and it's their home. For us, at least for me, the way I've been brought up to think about the environment is to think that everything exists and it's beautiful and we should protect it, but we need to protect it so that we can use it for our own well-being, for our own benefit. We protect forests because they're beautiful and they provide shade cover and they are carbon sinks. That's a service they provide to us. That's an anthropocentric view of it, right? So one of the ways I've begun to reshape my relationship with nature is to say, this entity exists. It exists because it has been here for a long time or it has been planted here. And in addition to that, it provides all these services to me, or it has all these different uses. It's beautiful. I can get fruits from it. I can sit under it. It'll probably purify the air. And that takes some practice to do, but I've come to learn, and this is quite a powerful learning, is that once we begin to view nature as an entity that exists outside of our own use, then we can start to see why it's so important to conserve it. One of the things I've come across is that if we view everything in relationship to the human being, that everything exists and has a value only because it has a relationship to the human being, then what we're missing out is that everything in the world is interconnected in some way or the other. We talk about the butterfly effect, that a tornado in Brazil can have an effect on the farmlands in New Zealand. It is possible. Many months ago, if you were to say that a bat infection in a human being could infect a small businessman in Western America or in a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean, you would have been called crazy, but it's possible, right? And so we need to reshape our relationship with nature to try and understand how interconnected everything is so that we can protect ourselves, so that we can live on this planet for a lot longer, and so that we don't run out of resources. The Amazon rainforest has been destroyed. It is being destroyed as we speak. And that's because we think we are getting something out of it. By destroying it, we can use the land for something that can help the people. Of course, we can. But at the same time, we don't fully understand what burning the Amazon rainforest will do. We have a good idea of everything that can happen, but there are still so many things that we don't know. And sort of the other thing is, we're experiencing a lot of environmental crises in the world, and sometimes we simply don't know where they come from. And we don't know what the consequences of some of them are socially, economically, and politically. We don't know. And and so when we begin to reshape our relationship, we begin to think outside of this relationship, and we start to see how other environmental entities are connected. And in doing that, we're equipping ourselves to understanding the true extent of our actions. We saw this happening with the UK earlier this year, where they wanted to build the third runway of the Heathrow Airport, and the Court of Appeals rejected it and said, come back with a better proposal, because they didn't take into account all the emissions and how it would raise the overall temperature in the world. Why are we so scared about the temperature rising above 2 degrees Celsius? Because it would create a situation where things unfurl at an unprecedented rate that we do not know of, and it could have damaging consequences for everybody. So I think reshaping our relationship with nature is so important there, simply to understand everything we don't know, that everything is interconnected. And if we only look at things in how useful it is to us, we're missing out on everything else that's going on. And I want to end this by sort of talking about how we can look towards the future, how we can change things. So a lot of the discourse right now is on how we can't use frameworks and systems that existed in the last century in this century, because the problems are unprecedented. They are problems we have never seen before. We were constantly updated by the UN that we have these many years, we have these many decades to save the environment. But what's happening is we're using age-old systems and age-old ideas to solve new world, new unseen issues, and that's not going to work. So instead, what we can do, at least on an individual basis, what all of you can do, is start small. Start thinking about how everything is interconnected, how various things in the environment, in your environment, be it urban, be it rural, be it in a forest, anywhere, be it on a coastline, how they can exist outside of their usefulness for human beings. And slowly you'll start to see how things connect. And then you'll start to see the bigger picture, and then we can equip ourselves better. We need to come up with new solutions. We need to do more research. We need to do far more things. Policymakers need to really rely on the evidence and less about the politics to create solutions and instruments that are new for the new world and aren't dependent on the old world. So yeah, that's sort of it. I hope you all enjoyed. And I'd love to talk to any of you about it. I'm sure Tanish will link me in the Instagram post. So do hit me up. And yeah, Tanish, Rishabh, it's been great. So thank you for having me.